order to have any chance of escaping, the submarine needed to be level. One of the injured men then managed to activate the flooding valves for the forward ballast tanks, allowing seawater to rush in and bring the sub level. This was a risky move, but it worked, and soon after, the tanks on a flat on the sea floor. This meant the immediate danger had passed, but now they faced a slower one. Trapped 180 feet below the surface with dwindling air, the men had a choice to make. Either wait for rescue that would probably never come, or attempt an escape that never been done before. To escape the submarine, the survivors would need to use the escape chamber, which was a small, pressurized room designed for emergencies. It could only fit a handful of men at a time, but it was their only option. And considering the chaos around them, the men stayed remarkably calm, even without their commander's presence. Richard had actually been blown off the bridge when the torpedo struck and was thrown into the sea. So command of the escape mission fell to the senior man still second side. And shortly after, the survivors made an orderly line to the escape chamber. What they would have to do next would be far from an easy escape, even in calm conditions. In fact, it would be almost unprecedented, but to make matters worse, a Japanese patrol was circling the tank from above. Every so often, depth charges were dropped into the water and shook the hull of the damaged submarine. These nearby explosions would actually fill the tank with the smell of burning insulation, and one particularly close detonation triggered an electrical fire near the forward battery, causing smoke to pour through the passageways. The heat also climbed fast, making the escape all the more important to pull off quickly. By the time everything was ready to go, it was dawn, and breathable air was dwindling quickly. The men then readied their mumps and lungs, which are small breathing devices strapped to the chest that allow for a slow and controlled ascent. No crew had ever used them in real emergencies, and they had only been used at practice sessions inside training tanks. But now, the lives of the tank survivors depended on them. One by one, the crew tested the valves and nose clips, checking for leaks and ensuring that their devices were ready. The escape chamber itself was barely big enough to move in and was about the size of a phone booth. The way it would work is that 4 men would squeeze into it at a time, and once inside, the chamber door would be closed and the room would be filled with seawater. They would then wait for the pressure to be equalized, and the escape hatch would then be pushed open, and they'd kick upward through the darkness, guided by a rope attached to a buoy that was rigged to float on the surface. Or at least, that was how it was supposed to work. One sailor, George Zoffson, admitted while waiting for his turn that he couldn't swim. So rather than join the others and attempt to escape from the Tang, he simply turned away and went back to his bunk, where he lay down and waited to die. The first group went up around 6 a.m., the next 4 went after them, and then another 4. As each group waited their turn, they all knew that any hesitation meant death for everyone still inside, but in the chaos, only 13 survivors managed to make it out of the escape hatch. By the time the last few men climbed into the escape chamber, the fire from the forward battery was raging. The metal around them was so hot that paint was literally melting off the bulkheads and running down the walls. Their eyes burned from the heat and the fumes as the men sealed themselves in the escape trunk and waited for the water to rise. But just making their way through the hatch to the open sea outside was no guarantee they'd survive the trip to the surface. Keeping hold of the buoy line was the difference between life and death. At 180 feet underwater, it's pitch black, and these sailors wouldn't be able to tell up from down once they were through the hatch. By grabbing hold of and following the line, they'd keep their bearings and eventually reach the surface. But in the confusion and pitch darkness outside the hull, many of the survivors lost their grip on the buoy line and drifted away in the sea. In the end, only 6 of the 13 men who escaped from the tank reached the surface alive. The rest were overcome by exhaustion, disorientation, or any number of potential things that could have gone wrong between the escape hatch and the surface. Those who survived then floated in the open sea, using their mumps and lungs to stay afloat as the sun rose at the horizon. They were alive, but just barely, and meanwhile, 78 of their fellow crewmen and officers were dead, lost either in the explosion or during the escape. Among the dead was a 15-year-old named Reuben McNeil Rayford, who is likely the youngest American to die in combat during the entire war. The survivors would have no time to grieve or even be thankful to survive, though. They were now miles from land and surrounded by enemy ships. When daylight broke over the former Formosa Strait, the sea was calm as the survivors clung to debris and scanned the horizon for any sign of help. Fortunately for them, all they could see were Japanese ships. But by mid-morning, a Japanese frigate known as the P-34 spotted them. The men tried to keep still, hoping to be ignored, but the ship suddenly changed course and headed straight toward them. And even worse, on its deck were survivors from vessels the Tang had sunk in the days before. Some of these men were badly burned from steam and fire, and their bandaged faces and blistered skin made them almost unrecognizable as humans. A whaleboat was then dispatched from the P-34, and the Tang survivors could see men rowing toward them with their rifles, and when the Japanese sailors reached them, the tone was clear from the start. The survivors were then dragged onto the boat before being savagely attacked. One of the Tang survivors was also already weak and struggling to breathe from inhaling so much water on his descent. But instead of helping him, his captors pushed him back into the water and rowed away, leaving the ocean to finish him off. When the 5 remaining survivors reached the P-34, they were reunited with 3 other surviving officers, including Richard. That meant that among the 87 on board the Tang at the time of the explosion, these 8 were all that remained. Once they were all on deck, the brutality continued. The men were stripped of their gear and their hands were bound behind their backs. They were then forced to sit on the ship's steel deck without any protection from the sun, and without any food or little water for 5 days and nights. The heat scorched their skin, giving them blisters across their backs and shoulders. The crew also taunted them, sometimes yanking their heads up by their hair and shoving lit cigarettes into their noses or ears. When the P-34 finally made its report in Formosa, the Americans were marched to the streets with their hands tied and hoods pulled over their heads. Civilians came out to watch, and children, old men, and women hit them with sticks as they passed by. That night, they were thrown into a root cellar where they scavenged raw potatoes from the dirt floor to survive. This was the first thing they'd eaten in nearly a week. The next day, they were loaded onto another vessel bound for Japan. The ship carried a cargo of sugar, and the survivors of the Tang were kept below deck in choking heat and given almost nothing to eat or drink for the entire voyage. By the time they reached Japan, the survivors already endured more than most men can imagine, but their suffering was far from over. What awaited them inside the walls of the Japanese prison camps would pale in comparison to their treatment to that point. Their first stop was the interrogation camp at Ofuna, which wasn't the sort of place that showed up on maps. The Japanese government didn't acknowledge that it existed, and the prisoners there weren't listed as captured servicemen. They were stripped of their names and rights. The guards told the survivors outright that they were not considered prisoners of war at all, but instead war criminals. Their reasoning was that the Tang had targeted and sunk civilian ships, and by that logic, its surviving crewmen were murderers. This was verifiably false, but that unfortunately didn't matter at the time. The treatment of the Tang survivors afterward matched the accusation. The men were kept in total isolation and forbidden from speaking to one another or anyone else in the camp. They were fed barely enough food to stay alive, and when they failed to answer questions to the guards' satisfaction, savage attacks began. The survivors were already starved and dehydrated when they arrived at Ofuna, but within weeks they were thin almost to the bone. Their hair fell out in clumps and their teeth loosened from scurvy. They were even stricken with a condition known as beriberi, a vitamin B deficiency that causes weight loss, limb pain and weakness, and even heart failure. Richard, one of the Navy's most esteemed commanders, spent his days confined to a small, windowless cell and was weakened to the point of barely being able to stand. Then in early 1945, the entire group of survivors was transferred north to the camp at Omori, located on an island in Tokyo Bay. It was still winter by this point and the cold was brutal. The prisoners were forced to march through the snow barefoot, and the barracks they were kept in were little more than unheated and drafty shacks that were infested with lice. Their meals came twice a day and consisted of small bowls of rice mixed with barley, or if they were unlucky, nothing but hot water with a few grains floating in it. And the guards there continued to treat them as less than human as well. Beatings were routine and often came from nothing more than glancing up without permission. Over time, the survivors learned to move slowly and speak quietly. Any sense of defiance was beaten out of them, and in a way, even just maintaining their dignity would be seen as an act of rebellion. Months would go on like this with no word outside Omori's walls. The men could hear distant air raids over Tokyo, but they had no idea how the war was progressing. Then in August of 1945, the bombings just stopped. The guards' attitudes also seemed to change overnight as they suddenly became uncertain and quiet. One day, most of the guards were simply gone, and the one who remained told the survivors that the war was over. From that point on, the prisoners controlled the prison, and within weeks, Allied aircraft appeared overhead, dropping supplies to them. Finally, on August 28th, the Tang survivors were liberated. Emaciated and sick from malnutrition, they were flown to Guam for medical treatment before they were well enough to return home. All 8 of the men who lived long enough to become prisoners of war survived the entire ordeal. Each of them would carry scars that would last a lifetime, both seen and unseen. They never forgot the sound of that torpedo exploding near the control room or the darkness that followed it. And years later, they still carried the weight of what they'd seen and lost in October of 1944. Although Richard was hailed as a hero, he rarely spoke about the ordeal himself. When he received the prestigious Medal of Honor for his actions and leadership, he accepted it on behalf of his crew and called them the bravest men he ever knew. The wreck of the Tang still rests in the Formosa Strait, and its exact position is known only in rough coordinates.